Well, welcome to the Election 2020 California Proposition Review. My name is Mark Schneider with Calvary Chapel, East Anaheim Salt and Light Ministry, and we welcome you to this session. Obviously, we'd rather be with you in person, but given the conditions on the ground, hopefully this will suffice. This session is probably going to go between 60 and 90 minutes, so if you need to pause the presentation and move around, certainly feel free to do so. There's a lot of material to cover. As you may know, about half the states in the country have what is called an initiative proposition scenario where the voters can directly petition to have their voice heard in a general election via the initiative process. This election season, we have 12 propositions that we're going to be reviewing. Some of them are what we've seen before, bond issues and tax issues and things like that. Some of them, however, are more substantive. But before we get into this, I think it's important to review some key dates. So let's do that. Starting with October 5th, which was a couple of days ago. This is the date, according to the Registrar of Voters, when mail ballots are beginning to be mailed out. Some of you may have already seen these, some of you may have not, but I think you should expect them fairly soon in your mailbox. October 19th is the last day to register to vote. That's a very important date. Make sure you keep that one in mind if you're not registered to vote. And then, of course, Tuesday, November 3rd, is Election Day, the most important day of November, likely. Vote by mail ballots must be postmarked by 11/3. So you can vote by mail. We're going to talk about that in a little more depth, but just make sure that they are postmarked by the 3rd of November. Okay, if you're not registered to vote, how do you do that? Well, if you were here on site, we would help you to do paper registration as we have in the past. But it's so easy to do online. All you need to do is go to this site. If you need to write this down or just pause it and click this into your browser, feel free to do that. But it's registertovote.ca.gov. Registertovote.ca.gov. And you can do this so quickly. And if you're not registered to vote, that is priority number one. You have to be registered, obviously, before you can vote in November's election. So make sure that you do that. Now, there is same-day voter registration at polling places, which today are known as vote centers. So you're going to hear this new parlance quite a bit. They're known as vote centers, but you may hear the term polling center as well. And there you can get on the site California or just CA earlyvoting.sos, stands for Secretary of State, .ca.gov to get more information about that. All right, the governor's executive order. Now, the governor's executive order says that vote by mail ballots will be mailed to all registered voters in California. This is something new this year. Of course, in the past elections, we've had what are called absentee ballots for people that for one or another reasons actually could not go to a polling station. That has changed this year. Every voter, whether or not you decide to go to a polling station, a vote center, or actually mail in your vote card, you will find in your mailbox a vote by mail ballot. For a nearby vote by mail drop-off location, you can go to this website, caearlyvoting.sos.ca.gov. Now, at least one actual polling place or vote center will be designated per voting precinct. And that's from Saturday, October 31st through Monday, November 2nd. And on Tuesday, that's vote day, November 3rd, from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. How to vote. Okay, now that you're registered and you know how you're going to vote, how do you actually do it? Well, at Salt and Lake, we have some specific recommendation. Absolutely, the best way to vote to make sure that your vote is counted accurately is to do it in person at a vote center from October 30th through November the 3rd. Actually show up physically, put your mask on, go to the vote center, go inside a secure booth, and have your ballot scanned. Why do we say that? Well, you've probably heard the news that people are predicting lots of potential problems with mail-in ballots. And that just stands to reason. The more human hands actually touch a mail-in ballot, the more cause there is or potential for problems to happen. So if you want to avoid all of that, make sure that you go to a polling station yourself, personally, and go through the process just like you have in the past. Now, not everybody is going to be able to do that. We understand that. Many people, for health reasons or infirmity or for whatever reason, they just cannot get to the polling station. If that's the case, then you should do what's second best, which is hand deliver your ballot to the registrar of voters, and that's located here in Orange County in Costa Mesa, a vote center, or a secure drop box. And we'll talk about how to find those. The least preferred method of voting, according to what we believe, is to actually mail in your ballot. We know that millions of people are going to do that, but if you want to avoid any risk of something happening with your ballot, then we urge you to do either number one, ideally, or number two. Okay. So here's an example of the result you get when you type in our church address at ocvote.com/vote center. And this is a site that's set up by Orange County to tell you where the polling stations actually are. Now, you can view this, and when you go to this website, you'll just type in your address to wherever your location is, and it'll bring up a map that looks like the one on the screen here. And you'll see multiple addresses of locations where you can go to actually vote. An alternative is to go to the Secretary of State website, and if you do that, you're going to find a site that looks like this. Find your polling place, and there's a little dialog window there, voting information tool as shown here. And once again, you will type in your address and you should see something that looks like this. It'll have a little map that's filled in with a bunch of bubbles. And the one that's closest to your address will be highlighted. It'll be the largest bubble on the map. If that one doesn't suit you, you can click on the other bubbles, and it will actually show you the address of that vote center or drop box that's the closest to your home. So both of these are good resources to find a very convenient vote center or drop box. Okay. What does a mail-in ballot look like? Well, here's a picture of it. If you haven't already received it, this is what you're going to find in your mailbox. It looks pretty official, but you don't want to take any chances, so make sure that it actually looks like this. And when you use this form, and you probably want to use that, to fill in your ballot, even if you go to a polling station, just so you know you're prepared and you know how you're going to vote. But if you do decide to mail it in, there's two critical things. Make sure you sign and seal the ballot. That is critical. Of course, this is all new for us. I actually haven't received the mail-in ballot yet, so I haven't personally looked at it. So you want to make sure also that you read very carefully all the instructions to make sure that you filled this out properly. The worst thing that could happen, not only human tampering with your mail-in ballot, but if you've done something wrong, if you haven't filled it out correctly, if you've put in misinformation, if you didn't sign it, if you didn't seal it correctly. And that would be terrible if after all your efforts to learn about the propositions and the candidates, your vote was not counted because of some technical error. So please take time to read the instructions, sign it, seal it before you drop it off at a drop box or actually put it in the mail. Now, there's a facility, and of course this is new too, we've never used this before, to actually track your ballot. You go to this site, where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov, and it's going to ask you some questions when you go to that site, like your name and address, who are you, and it'll check to see if you're actually registered to vote, and it will track your mail-in ballot to see if it's actually been received. At least theoretically, that's what they're telling us. We haven't done this before, so we don't know. But I strongly advise you, if you don't go to a polling place, to take this step. where'smyballot.sos.ca.gov. Okay, now also in the mail, you should have received the Presidential General Election Guide. Here's a picture of it. Which is a sample ballot. So it lays out all the candidates that you are going to be voting for, all the propositions, all the local measures. So make sure that you have received that. And if you want more information about the things that I've just talked about, where to find polling stations, how to do a mail-in ballot, all the typical things associated with actually physically voting, you can find it in this brochure that you should have already received. Okay, this slide is a little bit out of order. If you want to track your ballot, you can go, as I've already mentioned, where'smyballot.sos.california.gov, and it's going to show a screen like this. And as you can see here, you just fill in the information, and you should be good to go. Okay, sorry about that. We go back. Here we go. California 2020 propositions. There are 12 of them this year. And before we get started in reviewing these, I want to draw your attention to a voter guide that has in-depth analysis on each one of the propositions that we're going to be discussing today. And to find that online, you go to this site, voterguide.sos.ca.gov. It's a large document. You're going to find it in PDF form. You can download it to your computer, and at your leisure, if you need more information on the things that we're talking about today, that is the resource that I would strongly recommend you reviewing. Our intention here today is not to tell you how to vote. We're going to give you some information. We're going to give you some biblical principles on how to think about these propositions, sort of a thought process approach to viewing them. But it is not our job to completely educate you or to instruct you on how to vote on each one of these propositions. That's your job. So if the information that we talk about today is insufficient to help you make a decision one way or the other, please take advantage of this resource. There's tons of information there. Okay, as I mentioned, there's 12 propositions. We have the usual bond and taxation measures. But this election cycle includes many other substantive issues the voters are going to be asked to decide. But before we get to these, let's review some biblical principles that will hopefully provide some guidance on how we should approach our decisions. Now, There are many biblical principles regarding how we make decisions in life, how we vote for propositions and candidates. They're actually too numerous to highlight here in any one slide, but we have to pick some. So let's just highlight a few of the more important ones that are relative to what we're going to be discussing today. One biblical principle exists about the purpose of government. The government exists to restrain and punish evil. You can find that in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. That's the primary purpose of government, to restrain and punish evil. It's not to do everything else. It's not to care for us from cradle to grave. That is its primary job. And government is supposed to be limited according to the biblical worldview. There's this classic passage in 1 Samuel chapter 8 where the people are clamoring for a king like the other nations. They want a king. They want to be like the other nations. Of course, they've been under the judges for hundreds of years, but now they want that government model to change. And of course, the prophet warns them. You could do that. You can certainly have a king, but forewarned is forearmed, because once that happens, he will take. One thing leads to another. The best of your vineyards, the best of your crops, the best of your laborers, the best of the income that you derive from all your hard labors. He will take. And certainly if mankind offers us any lessons in governments, that's what they do. So a biblical principle is have a limited government. Justice. We hear a lot about justice. It's a prominent biblical theme. But the scriptures also talk about justice being impartial. And we're hearing a lot about special rights for certain ethnic groups and white privilege and BLM. It's prominent all over the news these days. But according to the biblical model, we are not to take ethnicity or color or even financial conditions in consideration when we are dispatching justice. The scriptures say, don't pervert justice. In fact, it says, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. That comes out of Exodus 23. So this is something to keep in mind when we're making decisions on these propositions. What about liberty? Well, liberty certainly is a biblical principle. We find it throughout the scriptures. But the scriptures talk about ordered liberty. Liberty versus license. Yes, we have individual liberty, and individual liberty is more important than group liberty or ethnic liberty or racial liberty. Liberty goes right down to the individual, but it's always bounded by certain principles. And we find these in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments. Two that come to mind is you shall not steal. Your liberty is bound by the fact that you shouldn't take from others what doesn't belong to you. In fact, you shouldn't even covet what legitimately belongs to others. That's a sin. So when we think about liberty, it's ordered liberty. What about debt? Well, obviously the scriptures have a lot to say about debt. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. That's Proverbs 22:7. So we are to try to avoid debt wherever possible, and that includes not just us as individuals, but our governments as well. Obviously, government doesn't do a particularly good job in any nation on the earth of paying attention to this biblical principle. But if it did, it would be much better off. And this wise counsel should be reflected in the way that we vote. Godly leaders. When the righteous increase, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. Psalms 14, Proverbs 29. Believers in the Lord Jesus should really seek out godly, righteous leaders. That's not always possible. Obviously, most people who are running for office are not Christians. But if they are exhibiting righteousness, we should look for that. Our minds should be attuned to their personal behavior. What do they believe in? What are their platforms? Life at conception. It's unfortunate that we even need to talk about this, but it's been a prominent issue for decades in our country. Life begins in the womb, according to Jeremiah 1:5 and Psalm 39. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So that is our belief, that is what we're taught in the scriptures, that life begins at the womb. And finally, the last biblical principle, and we've never talked about this before because we haven't had to, but this is the reality that we live in today. This is the society we live in, and so we have to point it out. The Bible clearly teaches that there are only two genders and that they are definitely binary. There's a male gender and a female gender. He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. That's Genesis 5 and Mark 10. So these are just a few biblical principles to keep in mind as we think about how to vote on these propositions. You know, the founders of our country also laid out some wise counsel that we should consider. They also believed in a very small, limited government. And they believed in this term called subsidiarity, which means problems should be taken care of at the lowest possible level. That's the beauty of the nuclear family. That's what God intended it for. The nuclear family takes care of its own. That's the first place that we go to when we need support and sustenance. Only when the nuclear family can't take care of a problem do we elevate it outside that small community, to the extended family, and then maybe to our church body, and then maybe to the local community. And only then do we go to our local city government. And only if the city government can't solve the problem do we escalate it to the next level, the state government. And finally and lastly, do we actually seek a remedy for our problems from the federal government. This is a concept that the founders of our nation strongly believed in. They also believed in separation of powers, the idea that all power should not be vested in one branch of government, whether it be federal or state, or whether it be the Article 1, the legislature, the executive, the judicial branch. Power should be separated so that it does not collect in one particular organization. Power corrupts, as Lord Acton said, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Representative government versus a pure democracy. This isn't an issue so much on this particular election cycle, but it is an important concept just to remember. Pure democracy is 50% plus one wins every decision. That's not the form of government our founders believed in. They believed in representative democracy. In fact, outside Independence Hall, when the founders finally signed off on the Constitution, you remember the woman asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, sir, what did you give us?" And his response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Well, we are still trying to keep it. Dennis Prager, a friend of Christians, the prominent radio talk show host, he says you can find American values on a coin. Just take out a coin, and there's three American values that are still inscribed there: liberty, e pluribus unum, which is the Latin expression that means out of many one, and in God we trust. Each one of those is facing serious threats today. But these, again, are principles we should keep in mind when we're reviewing these propositions. So let's try to put these into practice. But before we do, it's very important to understand where the prominent party platforms land on each one of these issues. And I'm not going to take time to go over this entire chart, but I advise you to review it yourself. We have very carefully looked at the party platforms and the particular issues relevant today to the biblical principles that we have just discussed. And I think you will see that there is a bright difference between the two parties. So this is also something you should strongly keep in mind as you're not only reviewing the propositions and how you're going to vote on those, but also the candidates that you're going to vote for, whether it's a local candidate, state candidate, or a federal candidate. Okay, well, let's get into the propositions. Proposition 14 is the first one. Here's the title to it. It authorizes bonds continuing stem cell research. It's an initiative statute. Now, what it does is it authorizes $5.5 billion for bonds for continuing research in stem cells. The money would specifically fund grants from the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, or CIRM, to various entities to conduct the research. Now, stem cells are cells that, one, have the ability to divide and create an identical copy of themselves, and two, can also divide to form cells that mature into cells that make up every type of tissue and organ in the body. And that's why these are so interesting, because if you can use a stem cell to turn into another type of cell that a diseased body is having problems with, whether in the kidney or the liver or the heart or something else like that, this has tremendous medical benefit. $1.5 billion of this bond money would go toward diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, epilepsy, and other debilitating diseases. Now, of course, a bond is an IOU. This is money that's being borrowed. It's a debenture. And like all debt, people want to be paid back with interest. And of course, that's the case here. So if you review the documents, you will find out that once the bond is repaid, it's not $5.5 billion, it's $7.8 billion. But even more concerning, notwithstanding the benefits of stem cell research, if you read the legislation carefully, you will find out that the stem cell research includes what are called blastocyst stem cells. These are cells that 12 days after fertilization, or fetal stem cells. Now, why is there a problem with this? Well, let's think about some biblical principles with regard to this issue. What about limited government? Do we need another spending measure? Does this reduce the size of government, or does it add to it? Avoiding debt is another biblical principle. Does this help us reduce the debt load that we're already facing in California, or does it expand debt? What about life at conception? If we believe that, then this bond would fund research into cells after conception. And this should be strongly considered before you decide how you're going to vote on this particular bond issue. That was Proposition 14. Let's move to the next one, Proposition 15. I'll just read the title to you. Increases funding sources for public schools, community colleges, and local government services by changing tax assessment of commercial and industrial property, and it is an initiative constitutional amendment. Well, this brings up a question. What's the difference between an initiative statute and a constitutional amendment that the voters vote on? Well, constitutional amendments take more signatures to qualify, and if passed, they cannot be challenged on California constitutional grounds. If you remember back to the days of Proposition 8, we voted back in 2008 to keep marriage as between one man and one woman. That was a state statute that we voted on. Of course, the courts turned that over, so we voted again. And the second time we voted, and the courts turned it over because they claimed it violated the state California Constitution. So we voted on it again, actually amending the California Constitution so people could not raise that challenge. Of course, you know the history. The courts inevitably overturned that as well. But that's what it is. But that is the difference between just a simple and initiative statute and an initiative constitutional amendment. So what is this proposition about? Well, this would amend, this is an important one, this would amend Proposition 13, which was passed way back in 1978 through the determination mainly of one man and his organization. Everybody remembers the name Howard Jarvis. It was upheld as constitutional in a case called Nordinger versus Hahn back in 1992. So Prop 13 has been around for a long time, and what it basically does, it limits property tax to 1% of the assessed value at the time of purchase and limits an increase of property taxes to a maximum of 2% a year. And this applies to both residential and commercial real estate. Proposition 15 would change this for the first time in 42 years, and it would amend the California Constitution. Some are calling this a split roll property tax because it changes the treatment of property taxes on residential versus commercial. Proposition 15 would leave residential properties alone. So you wouldn't need to worry about your home, where you're living, the property taxes going up. But the property taxes on commercial property would change quite dramatically. Commercial business with over 50 employees or over 3 million in land and buildings will begin paying much higher property taxes because the assessments will be assessed based on current market value versus the original purchase price of that commercial piece of property. So if you bought a commercial piece of property 20 years ago and your current tax assessment is based on that price, you'd have to look, if this proposition was passed, what's that property worth today? And the property tax would be reassessed based on that market value. The increased taxes are estimated to garner between $7 and $12 billion, and ostensibly would go for public schools, community colleges, and local government services. Kind of an easy sell. Everybody likes giving money to public education. This would be phased in beginning 2022 through 2026. But before we look at the biblical principles, let's look at a little more background. This is a picture of the budget of California 4 years ago, back in 2016-17. And public education expenditures amounted to $66 billion back then. It's a lot of money, $66 billion. Today, 4 years later, that number has risen to $76 billion and consumes almost half of the general fund. Now, the general fund isn't the total California budget. That's something like $214 billion, but it's a significant amount, and $76 billion is a lot of money. Obviously, we're running a $4 billion deficit, but you have to ask, with $76 billion being spent, what are we getting for our money? Well, let's take a look. The Pew Foundation puts the United States in the middle to bottom rungs of academic performance when compared to other nations, most of which spend far less per student than we do here in the United States. And unfortunately, in California, we place lower still when compared to this sub-average U.S. performance. While our universities are able to compete in K-12 education, we rank 44 out of 50 according to U.S. News and World Report. So, and this doesn't even account for the fact that not only are kids not learning reading, writing, and arithmetic as they should be, of course we have this new indoctrination going on via comprehensive sexuality education, and now we're seeing critical race theory start to come into our universities and public schools. And since Proposition 15 is a tax, perhaps we should look at the many ways Californians are already taxed. Here's a chart that shows the many different ways you, as California citizens, are paying the state of California to live here. Our state sales tax is 7.25%. We have local sales taxes that average about 1.5%. We have excise taxes. These are additional taxes on certain items that you pay for, like gasoline, where that excise tax is 35 cents for every gallon of gas you buy. Property tax is the one bright area in California. Ours is 0.7% compared to a 1.05% national average. That's good, but it's only because of Howard Jarvis and Proposition 13. What about income tax? Well, California has the highest marginal tax rate in the nation. The 10 personal tax rates range anywhere from 0 all the way up to the very high earners in the state to 13.3%. And non-residents who work in California must also pay California income tax. So we are really soaking people that live in this state. What about capital gains? Well, that's based on your personal income tax rate. It's not handled the way the federal government does it. So there's no break for holding capital gains for over a year. Fortunately, there's no inheritance tax in California yet. So that's a bit of good news. But obviously, you can see we're very heavily taxed. So what about some biblical principles here? Well, obviously, limited government comes into place. Does this increase the size of government, keep it the same, or restrict the size of government? Well, clearly, we're adding anywhere from $8 to $12 billion in revenues to the state. We're taxing commercial properties. This is going to increase the size of government. What about impartial justice? Well, this isn't a spot-on linkage to treating residential and commercial properties differently. But it's good to keep in mind that that's exactly what's happening. We're treating these properties different. Proposition for many Californians has worked very well in the past. So this would change that paradigm quite dramatically. And you can assume, I think, that once this step is taken, of course, the next step would be to make the same argument that, well, we changed the tax rates on commercial property. Maybe it's time to change the tax rate on residential property as well. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about Proposition 15. Proposition 16. Okay, the title of this one is Allows Diversity as a Factor in Public Employment, Education, and Contracting Decisions. Once again, this would be a constitutional amendment. All right, what would this do? Well, it would bring back racial quotas in public employment, education, and government contracts. The sponsor of this bill, the lead sponsor, is Shirley Weber down in San Diego. And this is the same woman who was the sponsor for comprehensive sexuality education in California. It would amend our state constitution to allow race-based and sex-based affirmative action. A yes vote would repeal Proposition 209, which was passed back in 1996, that proposition prevented government and public institutions from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, and public contracting. A no vote would preserve Proposition 209. Martin Luther King said, let's go to the next slide and consider some biblical principles here. Impartial justice. Martin Luther King famously said that we should judge people not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. So we live in a strange day when we're being asked to vote to reintroduce basically racial quotas, ethnic quotas, sexual quotas in our government institutions. So it's hard to make a biblical argument in support of this. More importantly, Galatians 3, verse 28 says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. There is neither male and female, for you all are all one in Christ Jesus." Now, obviously, this is a spiritual principle talking about who we are in Christ. But you get the principle. I don't think that we should be paying particular attention to people's skin color, their race, their ethnicity when it comes to making decisions about their positions in government and public education. But that's for you to decide. Okay, let's move on to Proposition 17. The title of this one is, "It Restores the Right to Vote After Completion of a Prison Term." And once again, this is a constitutional amendment. Okay, this would restores the right to vote while still on parole. People in prison, as most of you know, are not allowed to vote in California. This proposition would amend the California Constitution to allow convicted felons still on parole to register to vote and therefore vote. They would also be allowed to run for elective office if they meet certain other qualifications, just as any other candidate would have to meet. The current law disqualifies felons from voting until their imprisonment and parole periods are completed. 30 states require convicted felons to complete parole before voting rights are established. In 1974, California voters approved restoring the right to vote for convicted felons once they've completed their sentence, including parole. People convicted of nonviolent felonies like car theft or drug dealing are incarcerated in county jails and already have the right to vote while serving their sentence. For them, there is no parole. There's a statistic that 50% of parolees are convicted of new crimes. This came right out of the voter information guide. You can read this yourself. And parole as a concept is the early release of prisoners who agree to abide by certain conditions of release in order to build societal trust. A period in California of between 5 and 10 years for sex offenders and other crimes, and for life for those who are actually convicted of murder. Proposition 17 would allow those convicted of crimes like murder, rape, sexual abuse against children, kidnapping, assault, gun crimes, and human trafficking to vote before completing their sentence, including parole. Okay, biblical principles. Well, certainly one comes to mind is that the primary purpose of government, including state government, is to restrain and punish evil. So what does punishment mean? Is carrying out one sentence in prison sufficient punishment, or should that punishment be extended to make sure that the convicted person actually is able to integrate in society? And should we wait for that process to play out before we thoroughly reintroduce them into society and allow them voting rights? What about impartial justice? Well, is it justice to deny a person to vote after they've completed their prison sentence but hasn't completed their parole period? Or does justice include what many feel is common sense, that no, they have to finish not only their prison term, but we need to make sure that they are fully integrated back into society and are crime-free before we give them that privilege of voting? That's for you to decide. Proposition 18. Well, this would amend California Constitution to permit a 17-year-old to vote in primary and special elections if they will turn 18 by the next general election and be otherwise eligible to vote. And once again, this is a constitutional amendment. This would allow 17-year-olds to vote in just primaries and special elections, but only if they turn 18 by the next general election. Today, if you're already 18, you can vote in the next election. So this would amend the California Constitution. Let's talk about some biblical principles here. Now, a little background. The 26th Amendment to our United States Constitution lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 in 1971. In the 1971 case, Oregon versus Mitchell, a divided Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the right to regulate the minimum age in federal elections, but not at the state and local level. So states and local municipalities are free to change the voting age at will. Fortunately, this issue is being made available for the California voters to decide. But this lowering the voting age is a trend we're seeing more and more. San Francisco, you might have heard, is considering letting 16-year-olds vote in local elections. But is this a wise thing to do? Proverbs 22:15 says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. That's just reality. That the frontal cortex of the brain, we know from medical science, isn't fully developed until about 25 years old. That's why there was so much debate back in the day before we lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Yes, there are very mature 17-year-olds. They do exist. But to vote responsibly, one needs to not only be versant with the issues at play in any particular election and be informed about those and take the time to actually study them, but be wise enough and have enough personal experience in life to be able to judge these matters prudently. It's a question if a 17-year-old, let alone a 16-year-old, is wise enough to make these decisions. But again, these are things that you should consider before you vote on this particular proposition. Okay, Proposition 19. This would change certain property tax rules, and again, this is a constitutional amendment. So what is Proposition 19 all about? Well, currently in California, eligible homeowners that are over 55 can transfer their existing tax assessment base in their primary home, for example, to a different home of the same or lesser value in certain counties, counties that offer reciprocity to the county that you happen to be living in. So it allows you to move to some place. Maybe you just want to move out of Orange County to a nicer place, up in Napa, for example, and you don't want to pay a higher property tax than you have here. Well, you can do that in California. A parent's primary residence also passes to a child or grandchild at the current assessment, meaning the property tax does not go up after the transfer to a child or grandchild. Prop 19 would increase the assessment transfer throughout the state of up to 3 times. So that's a good thing. So if you're 55 and you want to move, not once, but 3 times, you can do that, and your property tax assessment under this proposition would not go up. But, there's a big but, a parent's transfer of residence to a child or grandchild would reset to market value if valued over $1 million and or not used as the child's primary residence. This ballot measure would eliminate the parent-to-child and grandparent-to-grandchild exemption in cases where the child or grandchild does not use the inherited property as their principal residence, such as using a property, a rental house, or a second home. When the inherited property is used as the recipient's principal residence, but is sold for $1 million more than the property's taxable value, an upward adjustment is assessed, value would occur. The ballot measure would also apply these rules to certain farms. Now, beginning on February 16, 2023, the taxable value of an inherited principal residential property would be adjusted each year at the rate equal to the change in the California House Price Index. So Proposition 19 would take away Proposition 58, even though it was approved by close to 76% of voters. Okay, biblical principles. Well, this is not an obvious one. Obviously, this measure is to increase the revenue coming into the state of California. It's not to decrease it. So even though you're being offered the chance to move more than one time and keep your assessed tax base, there's a gotcha. And that gotcha is you cannot pass your property on to your children or grandchild at the same property tax base rate. So does this expand keep the same or reduce the size of the California government? Well, if more revenue is coming in, obviously they're seeking to expand it. Does it add to the debt of California or does it increase it? You can decide. Okay, Proposition 20. The title of this proposition, and fortunately we're getting to the end, there are five more propositions, this is one of them, and then we'll be done. Proposition 20 would restrict parole for certain offenses currently considered to be nonviolent. It authorizes felony sentences for certain offenses currently treated as misdemeanors. This is not a constitutional amendment, so this is just an initiative statute. This would roll back, Proposition 20 would roll back the effect of prior laws that were designed to reduce California's prison population. A yes vote would add crimes to the list of violent felonies for which early parole is restricted. It would also create what are known as wobblers for certain theft and fraud crimes, and require DNA collection for certain kinds of misdemeanors. Now, a wobbler is something that prosecutors they can either view it as a misdemeanor or a felony. It kind of goes one way or the other. Wobblers are punishable by up to 3 years in a county jail, whereas misdemeanors, typically, it's a year or less in jail. Examples of a wobbler in Proposition 20 would be what they're calling serial theft. So this is a person with 2 or more past convictions for theft worth more than $250. So even though the amount of a theft conviction is small, it's the fact that they're repeat offenses. So this would be a wobbler under this law. Or organized retail theft, a person acting with others to steal more than $250. So if you're colluding with other people to steal, this would also, under Prop 20, be considered a wobbler. So this gives prosecutors discretion to charge certain crimes like firearm and vehicle theft, credit card fraud, as felonies instead of misdemeanors, as well as having these so-called wobblers. What about DNA? Well, currently, DNA samples are collected from all those convicted of a felony or registered as a sex offender. This proposition would increase the sample collection to certain misdemeanors, like shoplifting, forging checks, and certain domestic violent crimes. It would define 51 crimes and sentence enhancements as violent in order to exclude them from the parole review program and therefore early release. Some inmates convicted of some types of assault and domestic violence would be excluded from parole under this proposition, as would those who are considered to pose an unreasonable risk of violence. Biblical principles. Well, obviously restraining evil, as we've talked about, is a primary function of government. Protection of society and punishment of evil is biblical and a must for an orderly society. Does giving prosecutors discretion to treat certain acts of theft and violence as felonies, is that just? Remember that to be convicted, a person is still have to be tried by a jury of their peers, and judges do have sentencing discretion within statutory limits. So this just gives prosecutors more tools to delve out the right kinds of punishment and restrict parole for those in their estimation that don't warrant it. Proposition 21. Okay, the title of this proposition is Expands Local Government's Authority to Enact Rent Control on Residential Property. This is an initiative statute. A yes vote on this proposition would allow local government officials to enact rent control on housing that was first occupied over 15 years ago. So this wouldn't apply to newer homes. It exempts individuals who own and rent no more than 2 homes. So you may live in your primary residence and you have a condo or a vacation home. It would not apply to those, or maybe even have a rental. But if it's 2 or less, this law would not apply to those. It allows local limits, however, on annual rent increases. It allows rent increases in rent-controlled properties of up to 15%, that would be the maximum, over 3 years at the start of any new tenancy. So if you had a new tenant in one of your rental properties, you would only be able to increase the rent 15% in 3 years. This would actually replace the 1995 Costra-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, where landlords can increase rent to market value when a tenant moves out. So that's the way it is today. You may have had a tenant in a rental property that's been there for many, many years, and that tenant moves out, and they've been enjoying a rent or lease that's below the market value. This gives the property owner the ability to increase the rents to what the market would bear. Researchers at MIT estimate rent control measures like this result in an average reduction in home values of up to 20%. Homes and condos and townhomes are worth less if their income value as rentals is limited by local rent control strictures. So this exerts some centralized control, definitely, over market forces. So our biblical principles, limited government, are they getting a little too intrusive about what property owners can do with their own property? Is this a just law? What about liberty? This goes to free enterprise versus kind of a centralized government approach. Should you as a property owner be able to charge whatever you want for lessees and tenants that live in your property? This is for you to decide. Okay, Proposition 22. This one is entitled, Exempts App-Based Transportation and Delivery Companies from Providing Employee Benefits to Certain Drivers. Again, this is an initiative statute. A yes vote defines app-based transportation rideshare and delivery drivers, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash are typical examples, as independent contractors and not employees. So this proposition would roll back the effects of Assembly Bill 5, which many people say killed the gig economy. So these are people that want a second career, they just want to make some extra money, and so they decide to be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver or a DoorDash delivery person. These people in the past have not been considered employees of the companies that they work for. Employees, obviously, companies are required to pay all kinds of extra benefits and have all kinds of obligations that increase the cost of doing business for that company. Whereas if they're not employees but just independent contractors, none of those benefits and or obligations go to that particular independent contractor. So independent contractors are not covered by various state employment laws, including minimum wage, overtime, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. So the promoters of AB 5 said this is a reason to argue for AB 5. You know, we need for what are now independent contractors to enjoy these benefits. On the other hand, independent contractor drivers would be entitled under this new bill to other kinds of compensation, including minimum earnings, healthcare subsidies, and vehicle insurance. The ballot measure would override Assembly Bill 5, which was signed recently, just last year in September, on the question of whether app-based drivers are employees or independent contractors. And I should note, this bill, Proposition 22, is opposed by the unions in California, not surprisingly. Okay, what about biblical principles? Well, certainly limited government comes into play. This is an example of the government wanting to control the way people conduct their economic lives. Certainly, if you want to be a full-time employee of a company like Uber or Lyft, you have the ability to apply for a job and to work for them. But if you don't want to do that, if you've got other ambitions in life, but you just want to drive a delivery car or deliver meals, and you want to stay an independent contractor, you can do that under this proposition. You used to be able to do it before AB 5. So limited government certainly comes into play. What about ordered liberty? Well, this goes back to free enterprise. Should people be allowed to do what they want to do without the government telling them, nope, you can't be an independent contractor, you have to be an employee? So something to consider when you're voting for this measure. Okay, just a few more to go here, actually 3 more. Proposition 23. What would this do? Well, it establishes state requirements for kidney dialysis clinics, requiring on-site medical professional. Let's read a little bit more. A yes vote on Prop 23 would require chronic dialysis clinics to have an on-site physician administrator. That's not the case today. Some do, but most of them, and I think there's well over 1,000 dialysis clinics in California, have a nurse practitioner or an RN that manage these facilities. This would require a doctor to actually be on site. It requires clinics to also report dialysis-related infection data to state and federal governments. It prohibits clinics from closing or reducing services without state approval. It prohibits clinics from refusing to treat patients based on source of payment for care. This bill is being sponsored by SEIU-UH West, which is a very large labor union. But the bill is opposed by the California Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, American Academy of Nephrology, Chronic Disease Network, Renal Physicians Association, and others. The argument being that this would shut down hundreds of smaller dialysis clinics. Some are predicting that nearly half of the 600 clinics that are in operation today would have to close down as a result of the increased cost of having a doctor on staff all the time. Okay, biblical principle, limited government. Is this something that the government should be actively involved in? Telling a dialysis clinic that you have to have a physician on board. Bear in mind that dialysis patients are already under a doctor's care. They can't get dialysis treatment unless a doctor is signing an order and the doctor sends them to a dialysis clinic that does have medical staff on board, just not necessarily a practicing physician. So something to bear in mind when you're considering this proposition. All right, 2 more, we're almost done. Proposition 24, amends consumer privacy laws. Again, an initiative statute. A yes vote for Prop 24 would create a new privacy protection agency. So this would be a new government institution that's created to enforce the state's consumer data privacy laws. It would allow consumers, ostensibly, to direct businesses to not share their personal information. But the bill is being sponsored by big social media platforms and credit reporting companies. It asks consumers to pay for privacy, where if you don't pay, you could see slower speeds in the kind of services that are being offered online. Current California privacy rights follow you when you travel, but under Proposition 24, companies are allowed to capture health, financial information, and other kinds of data that's stored on your cell phone. Another complaint is that the law was hastily written and exceedingly complex and difficult to understand. The law is 52 pages long. Now, understand that California already passed the CCPA in 2018, the California Consumer Privacy Act, requiring businesses to tell consumers what information is being collected or sold and to give them notice. Proposition 24 is opposed by the Orange County Register, the Republican Party, and ACLU due to its complexity, vagueness, and poor construction. So it doesn't seem that many people are on board with this particular one. Biblical principles, would it restrain and publish evil? Maybe, who knows? You have to read 52 pages to really understand it. Limited government, well, this would create a new privacy agency. That does not limit government, that actually expands it. So again, something to think about when you're deciding which way you're going to vote on this issue. And last but not least, Proposition 25. This is a referendum on a law that replaced money bail with a system based on public safety and flight risk. What does that mean? Well, a yes vote on this Proposition 25 would replace the money bail system for a new system based on Senate Bill 10. We'll talk about that. A no vote would repeal Senate Bill 10 and keep the money bail system. Currently, people accused of a nonviolent crime have the choice of securing their release by posting bail or by order of a judge. Prop 25 replaces this right with an automated system based on predictive modeling of a person's particular risk profile, risk of flight. Now, Jerry Brown actually signed Senate Bill 10 into law. That's entitled the Money Bail Reform Act in 2018 to eliminate cash bail for a computer system that analyzes an arrestee's assessed risk. And it would either be low, medium, or high. Approval of this Proposition 25 would eliminate a release on bail, create a new process for release before arraignment, and change the existing process for release at arraignment. It would require, in essence, automatic release for most people facing misdemeanor charges within 12 hours of being placed in jail after arrest. At arraignment, people in jail would generally be released pending trial. DAs would have to request a special hearing to keep them jailed if they thought they were a flight risk. 67 out of 81 Democrats support the bill. 1 out of 39 Republicans did. And SB 10 was put on hold until outcome of this Proposition 25. A yes vote means that SB 10 will go into effect. If passed, it's expected that most arrestees for misdemeanors would not be jailed while awaiting trial. Okay, restrain and punish evil. Again, that's a principal responsibility of government. And impartial justice. So these are things to think about when you're considering how you're going to vote on this particular proposition. Okay, once again, before we conclude, I want to remind you, obviously some of these ballot issues are very complex, very confusing, and I've tried to give you a brief overview of what they mean, what they stand for, and some principles to think about when you're considering them. But I highly advise you to do your homework. Go to this resource that I've already talked about, voterguide.sos.ca.gov, if you still have questions about how you're going to vote on these propositions. And finally, if you want a biblically based online voter guide, obviously since church is closed down, we can't hand these out via paper, but if you have a computer, they're so easy to access online. Here's a number of them that are available to you. And it will give you recommendations from people who view life from a biblical perspective, think that you should vote on these particular propositions, as well as the candidates. Robin Nordell, she's a local here in Orange County. She has a very good resource. iVoterGuide.com is another great resource. Electionforum.org. iJudge Voter Guide is one for judicial candidates. And then finally, Nancy's Picks is another resource that you can go to. So I really do recommend that. Read the material, get educated yourself, and then go see what other people think before you draw any particular conclusions. And if you do these things, I think you can rest assured that you will make the right decision for you on how God leads you to vote on these particular issues. And regarding how your vote stacks up, in California, we live in a very interesting state. We have a supermajority of Democrats in this state, and oftentimes many Christians think that their vote doesn't matter. Well, in terms of voting, that doesn't matter. Duty is ours, said our sixth president, John Quincy Adams. Results are God's. The right to vote is a precious privilege that we have in America and in the state of California, and we need to exercise our vote. You know the statistics from Barna, who says that in any particular election cycle, only half of committed Christians are registered to vote. That's a crime. And then only half of those who are actually registered go to the polls on voting day, which means that in any particular election cycle, only 25% of committed Christians are making their voices heard at the ballot box. That has to change regardless of the outcome. So I hope that was instructive. Thank you for listening to me. Make sure that you vote, and if you can, vote in person. I'm Mark Schneider. God bless.